Didn't work just now. Was it supposed to work?
Yes, it.
Oh, okay.
Доброго дня, шановні колеги. Сьогодні ми маємо третю частину нашого лекторія щодо психічного здоров'я в умовах війни, в умовах військового конфлікту, який для нас проводять ізраїльські фахівці. Зокрема, сьогоднішня наша лекція, сьогоднішня наша розмова буде присвячена саме допомозі дітям в умовах стресу, в умовах необхідності навчатися дистанційно. І я відразу, перед тим, як я почну представляти нашого лектора, я б хотіла оголосити правила нашого лекторія. Перш за все, я би дуже хотіла тих учасників, які є в Zoom, відразу вимикати ваші мікрофони і камери. Наш режим не передбачає вільного спілкування в чаті, тому я дуже попрошу вас вимкнути ваші мікрофони. Це допоможе перекладачам працювати спокійно і, власне, чути добре спікера. Також я хочу наголосити, що ми маємо трансляцію в YouTube. Онлайн-трансляція в YouTube ведеться англійською мовою, але не переймайтеся, будь ласка, ми будемо виставляти запис українського перекладу через деякий час теж на нашому YouTube-каналі. Я хочу подякувати проекту Нейротвін і проекту Mental Health for You за партнерство в організації нашого лекторію. Саме завдяки нашій такій продуктивній співпраці сьогодні українські лікарі мають змогу прослухати цей лекторій і, власне, дізнатися про досвід Ізраїлю як однієї з таких довготривало країн, які перебувають у тривалому військовому протистоянні. Отже, допомога дітям. Перш за все, ми сьогодні поговоримо про такий педагогічний аспект, оскільки всі ми знаємо, що діти залишилися багато де без доступу до належної освіти. Всі ми перейшли знову в онлайн, і це також для дітей накладає певний стрес. І про психологічну стійкість дітей в умовах цього віддаленого навчання поговорить із нами докторка Адар Бен-Еліяху. Це старша викладачка і тимчасовий академічний керівник Міжнародної школи і голова консорціуму з питань молоді, дітей у тривалій кризі, відділу консультування та розвитку людини педагогічного факультету в університеті Хайфи. Пані Адар нам розповість більше саме про педагогічний аспект, оскільки ми припускаємо, що вам також доведеться працювати із педагогами, із викладачами, можливо, давати якісь поради, консультувати їх щодо того, як працювати з дітьми, як працювати з дітьми, які постійно перебувають у стресі. Не буду більше займати ваш час. Дякую, Адар, за цю можливість послухати корисну для нас інформацію. Передаю відразу слово вам.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. I'm happy to be here. I don't know that excited is the right word because of the circumstances that we are in. And hopefully at some point, you know, this will just be an academic topic and we won't have to consider the impact and how to actually use these findings and these ideas in the field. So I will be talking about sustainable learning and education and how we could support children during crisis. Some of this is related to really what we can do now. Some of this is kind of forward thinking. And, you know, I will be showing a study that is related also to COVID, which we've learned a lot from. So to start out, let's talk about a minute, what is dealing with crisis or extreme circumstances? So extreme circumstances are a state, of threat to the individual. It could be actual danger. It could also be a sense of danger. And we had a little bit of a discussion beforehand, but just like right now in Eastern Ukraine, there is actual danger. And in Western Ukraine, there's more of a sense maybe of danger. It's kind of like what's happening in Israel with the South being constantly under danger, and Northern Israel, not so much, but there is sometimes a sense of danger. So dealing with this is an extreme circumstance. And we can also talk about COVID, and we have here, children or students in masks or natural disasters. And I'm kind of starting from the takeaway here, which is the notion that we do have challenges when we're helping children cope with these ongoing crises. And one of the challenges, how do we maintain systemic sustainability for this during these different changes? How do the systems continue to function? How does the educational system continue to function? How does the medical system continue to function? How are we able to continue to see these children and youth and help them, whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking about the war conflict or terrorist attacks? And that's a huge challenge, and it's very important. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. And so when I think about these things, I think about educational sustainability, and this aligns with the UN's Sustainable Developmental Goals. So what can we do to help children and adolescents cope? How can we help them maintain their learning? Youth want to learn, they want to be educated, they want to be in a routine. And so what can we do in terms of that? One of the issues that we know is that when characterizing PTSD, there's a problem because the event that produces the trauma is either continuing and ongoing, or it hasn't ended. And so what's happening right now in the Ukraine, children might have traumatic stress responses, but it's not post-traumatic stress responses. And part of the complexity is that in PTSD, there is a decrease in attention and concentration, and also in daily functioning. So in order to be able to talk about a traumatic response, we know that part of the symptoms is not going to school or not going to work and not being able to focus and concentrate. And a lot of times, this brings to a misdiagnosis of PTSD when there is in fact, misdiagnosis of attention deficit disorder instead of PTSD. And so we'll see children and youth in schools, and professionals will diagnose them as having attention deficit disorder, when in essence it is PTSD that is anchored in some kind of a traumatic event. And one of the things that I invite us all to think about is how to adapt the support developmentally, and how to do this in a way that helps children the most amount of normative development that is possible. So with young children, we tend to go with them to play dates and to friends and to help coordinate. With older children and youth, the adolescents, we usually let them do that. But in a crisis situation, there is room for actually helping and kind of mitigating these meetings. And it's really important to help youth and adolescents meet. And so in the Ukraine right now, there might be shelters, and the shelters might be a safe place for adolescents, but how does one friend get from one place to the next? That might be something that's very difficult for youth to coordinate. And so it's important that parents do become involved. And if parents are unable to become involved, then either professionals or neighbors, grandparents. And so there's the whole host, and we'll talk about these different circles of influences. And so the talk is focused on the notion that resiliency may be taught through learning strategies. My work focuses on learning strategies and motivation in schools. And what I would like to propose is during war or during the pandemic or whatever crisis, it could also be a natural disaster that's going on, we can actually use these then learning strategies as a source of strength during the crisis event. And so thinking about sustainable education and thinking about how to create these learning opportunities, and then being able to transfer these strategies into these event-related situations. And to that end, I would like to suggest that even during a crisis, if we can somehow get some sort of a learning situation, even if it's for a short amount of time, we can then teach, and we'll talk about some of these regulatory capacities that are embedded within learning. And then these same strategies can be transferred for coping in general. So what's on the agenda today? I'll talk a little bit about definitions of crises. I'll talk about the baseline hypotheses, a little bit about dealing with these extreme circumstances or crisis, and then the direct and indirect circles of influence. Sustainable learning, I'll define it. I'll have a little bit of a study results, and then the impact. How can we apply these ideas? So definition of crisis. So as we were saying, definition of crisis is an extreme event. It's an extreme circumstance. It's unusual. We don't think of it as something routine that we would take part in on a daily basis. It's not the regular form of living. And we can talk about a physical threat or a threat to mental well-being. So it doesn't have to necessarily be something that occurs right now, but it can be something that I think will occur, even if right now everything is okay and I'm safe. Well, yesterday I wasn't. So right now my mental well-being is in a threat, because who knows what it'll bring tomorrow. And we do expect crisis to be something that passes. We don't expect it to stay. But we can talk about prolonged events, and we can talk about passing events. And what I have here in the prolonged event is the balloon. I'll just explain the picture. It's a balloon with a bomb, and this is something that we've been coping with in Israel, in the southern part of Israel. There are times when almost on a daily basis, these are transferred over the border from the Gaza Strip. And this goes unreported by the media. It's something that has become like a prolonged event. For over 20 years now, it's been happening. A passing event, here what I have is a picture of an earthquake. And, passing event is something that starts and ends. And when we think about these types of passing events, we think about a one-time thing. It's confined in time. War is expected to be a passing event. If it doesn't pass, then it becomes part of the prolonged event. And then we can talk about it as something that is part of the day-to-day, but it is something that we expect to have a beginning and an end. Even though it might take a few months for it to end, we still expect it to be a passing event. When we're during the actual wartime, we might feel as if it's a prolonged event. And so when we talk about prolonged events, we can talk about a rolling event, which is like the corona. The corona was something that was a rolling event. It changes and takes a different character from time to time. We cannot predict what happened. And so during COVID, the guidelines kept on changing, and they're still changing, right? Right now, at least in Israel, we don't wear masks now. There's no mandate. Traveling internationally, we still need to take these COVID tests, but we can travel, whereas a year ago, we couldn't really travel. A recurring event is different from a rolling event in that a recurring event is something that is the same. It comes and goes on a somewhat regular, though maybe unpredicted basis, but the same characteristics continue to exist. And so what I have here is the balloon with the bomb, and this is something that is known. A balloon bomb is sent over, it lands, and usually there's a whole fire that then continues. And so in southern Israel, balloons do not symbolize happiness and birthday parties and what we might expect balloons to be symbolic of for children and youth and adults as well now. So that's something that is the same every time it occurs. And so when we think about these different definitions of crisis, we can then say, well, how would it influence? And when I think about how would this influence learning, I think about the baseline hypothesis. And a lot of times when we research learning and education, we don't take into account the way that these forms of crises shape learning, because we think of learning as maybe in a sort of vacuum. And so in my work, I don't think of learning as in a vacuum. I think of learning as highly influenced by the emotions. And we can think about the pleasant emotions and the unpleasant emotions that one may feel as the baseline. And so if I'm feeling a pleasant emotion, that would be my starting point. And if I'm feeling an unpleasant emotion, that would be my starting point. So maybe on a regular basis, when I'm feeling good, you know, as a child, maybe I wake up in the morning and, you know, my school clothes are ready and I have breakfast, and mom and dad, or mom or dad or whoever takes me to school, maybe grandma, or maybe I go alone on the bus and I'm in a good mood. That would be the baseline from which I start when I get to school, when I start the learning. And it can also just be having a teacher that I like. So my expectation is positive. I have an affective inclination that is positive. And that's where I start from the whole entire emotional ups and downs. Whereas if I'm feeling an unpleasant emotion, so if I wake up and I don't know who's going to help me with breakfast, or maybe I missed the bus, or maybe there's a war going on, right? If there's a war going on, I don't even know if I'm going to school today or not. I don't even know what's happening. And so in that situation, the negative baseline is what shapes everything that occurs up and down in terms of that. And so when we think about these things, we can think about how they shape the different emotions that occur. And so that's our starting point. Let's see. Okay. And so then when we think about how to deal with extreme circumstances and crisis, is that a problem? I think someone is not on mute. We can talk about these extreme circumstances. I don't know, I can't mute. Okay, I'm okay now? I'm not on mute, okay. So dealing with the extreme circumstances, a lot of times the research is actually on passing events. There is not a lot of research on refugees. There is not a lot of research on ongoing events. There's not a lot of research on what to do when the situation is not over. The research now is beginning to be, you know, part of the mainstream, especially with the COVID, but in general, it's still mainly on passing events, especially when we talk about war and terrorist attacks. We usually have research that is retrospect or after the fact, and then with the post-traumatic or post-growth. So that's important to know. Not every extreme situation is perceived as traumatic, right? Events can be traumatic for one person and not traumatic for another person. Events can be very shaking for a certain person, and another person might be able to cope a little bit more easily and keep going. And so that's one thing to also think about. But when an event is perceived as traumatic, it has consequences. It doesn't just go on and continue. And for children and adolescents, there are symptoms of depression and anxiety, and I'm sure the medical professions here can attest to this situation in the Ukraine. A lot of times there's a diagnosis of PTSD, but there might also be risk behaviors instead of actually coping with the situation and being able to receive a PTSD diagnosis, especially for children and youth who do not necessarily have full-blown PTSD, and so it goes under the radar and it's not diagnosed, but they are coping with these different kinds of symptoms. So risk behaviors might be drinking or drug use. It might be trying to jump off a high cliff to see if I stay alive, or different type of things to just kind of take a risk and see, am I really worth it? There's also deficiencies a lot of times in information processing. And so children that are coping with these extreme circumstances, crises, aren't able to focus, not academically, not socially. And to that end, we can talk about self-regulation. A lot of times for younger children, we might see bedwetting or other kind of regressive behavior that that is a sign that they do need help. They might suddenly start sucking their thumb again. They might just act out and behave like a 3-year-old when they're already 8 and we've been through that. Well, now they're back to it. They might want to cuddle more, or maybe play with toys that they haven't played with in many years. And so seeing these different aspects in the different age groups and for the different children, and parents and professionals usually know their child and know what is a sign that there is something that's going on. And so being aware of this and being compassionate to that could be a place of help. And of course, as I was talking about beforehand, a lot of times this gets diagnosed as attention deficit disorder instead of PTSD. Because there's these deficiencies in information processing, and because the children are somewhat distracted and unable to focus on what's going on, and they're missing information, a lot of times the diagnosis is ADD, and then that's the way that it's being dealt with. It might be dealt with more in terms of medication, where the issue might actually be coping with a trauma. And a lot of times the caregivers and the professionals are also coping with the exact same kind of trauma. And so that even makes it a little bit more complex. So we can talk about these direct and indirect circles of influence. And when we talk about these circles of influence, we put the child in the middle, and we think of the child as the anchor through which everything occurs. And children live within some form of family. It could be their extended family that they live together. It could be just mom and dad. It could be mom and mom, dad and dad, all the different varieties, with siblings, without siblings. It could also be with their cousins and aunts and uncles, but there is usually a family that is part of that. And they go to a school, and the school is an important anchor within their lives. And this is all within a neighborhood. And so think about being displaced during war, and the neighborhood is no longer my neighborhood. And how can I study and focus during this time? But maybe we can think about ways to help children and adolescents continue their learning at least a little bit. And this is all embedded within a city. And friends, all of the different peers that are part of the group, these are also circles of influence. And this becomes especially important for adolescents and for youth and for young adults as well. And today we can also talk about the global internet, right? Everything is globalized. Everything I'm being, right now on Zoom with you guys, internationally on YouTube. So everything is globalized, and people can be in touch with anyone, anywhere, at any time. And we see what's going on. We see it online. We know what's happening. To that end, we can also share information, just like we're doing right now. And when we talk about learning, we can talk about learning within the individual. So the learning occurs within the intra-individual system. If we talk about these different systems of influence, we can talk about the intra-individual system, and that's where academic learning occurs. The microsystem is the family, the peer group, the different learning contexts. Am I learning in a school? Am I learning at home? Am I learning with peers? Am I learning by myself? And so forth and so on. And of course, the context conditions. And then we can talk about the exosystem, which are these broader related circles of the community, policies, social networks. And the interaction between all these systems is the mesosystem, but I'm not going to go too deep into this right now. The macrosystem are these national things. And so when we talked about the pandemic, we were in the macrosystem together, and we still are with COVID. And the war is a sort of macrosystem that then influences the intra-individual system of the child and the adolescent, of the learner. And the learning task, whether it occurs within the school, or here we have a young student online, as we shifted, and in the Ukraine right now, I understand a lot of the children and the youth are trying to at least somehow maintain some form of learning through the internet. And this learning task draws from the same resources as coping with the given reality. So if the reality requires us to cope and to use a lot of regulatory resources, then we are not as able to use these resources for learning. And so when faced with a crisis, most of the children and teens develop difficulties in their school, in learning. But there are children and teens who show resilience and continue to normal life after the event is over. And here I want to emphasize that we're talking about an event that is over, that is done with. And right now, we are not in an event that is over, not internationally with the COVID. And then for the Ukrainian people, my heart goes out to you because it's double, right? You not only do you have to cope with COVID, but now you have this war. And so my approach to thinking about these things is through the lens of self-regulation. And when I talk about self-regulation, I talk about this feedback loop of monitoring and changing. So being able to think about where am I, what am I feeling, and then changing accordingly. And we can really understand what this means if we think about how we feel. Are we hot? Are we cold? What's going on? When our body feels warm, we monitor that very easily. It brings us discomfort, and then we can change. We can turn on the air conditioner. We can take off the sweatshirt. And same when we're cold, we can then wear something warmer or turn on the heat. And so this monitoring and change is self-regulation, and we can think about it in the cognitive, emotional, or behavioral domain. And so in Israel, this is the home front command symbol. And so the home front command continuously provides guidelines for how the population should be coping with whatever's going on, whether it's the COVID, whether it's the war, whatever's happening. We can also think about emotional regulation in terms of feeling. How am I feeling? Am I feeling stressed? Do I need to change something to relieve that anxiety? And then behaviorally, during COVID, we were all challenged to continue wearing the masks all the time. And so that's behavioral regulation. And when we think about these forms in terms of how they are shaped within a school, we can talk about self-regulated learning. So self-regulated learning, or SRL, is a process of adjusting these emotions, behaviors, and cognitions to reach a learning goal. And so this feedback loop occurs around a learning goal. For example, if we talk about a cognitive learning goal, we could talk about understanding the guidelines, or understanding the materials, or understanding math, or maybe being able to analyze a literature in a certain way. And that would be my learning goal. And then being able to monitor how I'm doing that and whether I'm getting to the end of understanding it or understanding the piece of literature. And in terms of emotional regulation, it could be anxiety around an exam, or stress that I can't concentrate because I'm in a war shelter. And or it could be even, fear that I will be behind the rest of my peers because I'm not able to focus. And so we need to be able to monitor and then change that to allow us to study. And behaviorally, different behaviors that are related to learning. And so nowadays, the mask was part of behaviors that were part of learning. And it could be other behaviors, for example, handing in a paper, sending an email on time to your teacher to hand something in. And so these are self-regulated learning processes that I talk about and focus on. And they are related to, I think, a core of sustainable learning. And so sustainable learning, let's go into what that means. Sustainable learning, and I'm talking about sustainable learning in education, and I differentiate sustainable learning in education from sustainable learning in general. When we talk about sustainable learning, a lot of times the notion is around how to sustain the air and the water quality, or how to sustain food and other such resources. And so that is sustainable learning for these different resources. When I talk about sustainable learning in education, the idea is that learning becomes the resource to be sustained. So how do we sustain learning as the goal. And if we, as medical professionals, I'm sure you know that learning is something that children want, they need. That's how they feel productive. And that's also, like we were saying, children that aren't able to learn, it's a problem. It gets diagnosed as attention deficit, as PTSD. It's not some, or then we might look for other type of things that might be occurring that don't enable children and adolescents to learn. And so sustainable learning and education, the idea is that we're focused on the durability of the learning process itself. And so to that end, there's kind of 4 themes or 4 anchors to sustainable learning and education. One of them is the renewing and relearning of the materials, independent and collaborative learning, transferability, so being able to transfer from place to place, and active learning. So when we talk about renewing and relearning, we're talking about knowing how to renew and relearn relevant information and strategies, being able to recognize when something is no longer applicable. And this also requires self-assessment and knowledge. So the idea is that if I'm learning how to read, and so you might have first or second or third graders in shelters that need to learn how to read. Maybe they've already learned how to read, right? Especially if they're second and third grade. But maybe now they've kind of forgotten because they've been in shelters and they haven't been reading. They need to renew their learning. For us as adults, a lot of times when we're using our cell phone, we change or update, from one program to the next. There's a phone update, and then we need to renew what we know. We need to relearn how to use the phone applications. And then when we're able to self-assess and understand where we're at, we're then able to use meta processes. And we'll talk a little bit about what meta processes are, like metacognition and meta behavior and meta emotion. So that's the first core component of sustainable learning. For medical professions, a lot of times there's a lot of renewing and relearning, especially with the COVID. And I'm assuming in the Ukraine right now, having to create field hospitals and to find a new way to treat patients for different things, relearning how to do something that I know how to do in the hospital, in the field hospital. And for folks that are able to do that, then they're sustaining their learning, they're relearning how to do things. But not everyone can do that. And I'm sure you all have stories of colleagues that haven't been able to keep going despite their desire to help. Independent and collaborative learning is another core component of sustainable learning and education. So being an independent learner, of course, during COVID, children and adolescents were taxed with this. They needed to know how to learn independently. But they could also do this, and we do this all the time, right? YouTube, how to do something at home. Collaborative learning is being a team player, how to do it together. And then help seeking, when do I need help? During a war, a lot of times there might not be someone there to help. So a child might want to learn how to read or how to do math or how to do something, but there's no one there to help them learn, because teaching takes certain training. I might know how to do math, but I might not know how to teach it to my child. And then social support in different forms is also part of this independent and collaborative learning. So we usually tend to have a balance between these things. We usually tend to have a balance between what we learn independently and then some form of togetherness of how to then do this in a collaborative way. Another core aspect is transferability. So in order to sustain one's learning, despite all these changing and extreme circumstances, we need to be able to use the strategies, the skills, the knowledge in different contexts, settings, subjects. So I might learn how to create a to-do list in my history class so that I know, that I can read all the materials and then maybe write a project, some kind of paper that I need to hand in. And so using a to-do list, I could then transfer that to my math class. And so then I would have a to-do list of what are the problems that I need to solve, or maybe I need to go over, some kind of an equation or ask for help. And so we do this within learning. as we look at different classes, different courses, different teachers, students at the university, a lot of times transfer knowledge on how to study, so learning strategies and things like that. And one of the things that will enable supporting children and adolescents and maybe a form of resiliency building is this transferability. So if I teach children how to regulate their emotions, or how if they come in with a negative baseline emotion, a negative affective inclination, and I teach them how to regulate that so that they can study, well, now when there's COVID or there's a war, I can also tell them, remember when we practice that, let's do this for now on everything, or at least on certain occasions or for certain time periods. And so this transferability, the ability to take something I've learned in one context and then use it in a different context, is key to enabling us to help children and adolescents use what we teach them during school in their everyday life. And so related to this notion of resiliency building is also components of active learning. When we talk about active learning, we're talking about actively and intentionally seeking information. And so here I go back to this idea of self-regulated learning, where in self-regulated learning, we're monitoring our knowledge, we're monitoring and we're aware of what we might want to learn and how much of a gap we have. So epistemic knowledge as well. And then we can change the to have it help us learn and become more able with what we would like to do. And as we spoke before, we can do this in the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral domain within learning, and also then transferred into other aspects and situations in life in general. And so just a little bit of study results from a study that we did in the COVID here. And I decided to bring this because it focused on children. We do have some results also related to students, young adults, but I think that this makes more sense here because in this situation of this war, the idea is how can we support youth and how can we support children to be more resilient and to be able to continue and maybe even at some point grow and have this not be something that creates a post-traumatic disorder. And our question was how parent attitudes in lockdown 3 affected their children's adjustments at the end of the year. So thinking about how parents and how they were able to support their children from this aspect of self-regulated learning, the idea that self-regulated learning is a process of adjusting to obtain a specific goal during learning, and then that adjusting these learning processes to processes that then reach the learning goal is through this feedback loop of monitoring and changing emotions, behaviors, and cognitions. And of course that when we think about these things, we're talking about them as separate, but they're also highly connected and they overlap. And a lot of times it's hard for us to take them apart. But when we do talk about these components and their overlap, as long as everything is working, it's fine that we can't take them apart and we think of them as interchange and interlinked. But when there is an issue that comes up, being able to think about these components as different helps us pinpoint where we might help. And so when we talk about self-regulated learning, we're talking about the goals as the defining factor of what is the type of self-regulated learning. And we're talking about regulating towards these learning goals, whether they are behavioral, so being able to sit down and write, especially for kindergartners, that, you know, whenever the war is over, they're going to be going into first grade next year, right? So they need to be able to write, to hold a pencil, fine motor development. It's really important at that age. Emotional regulation during learning, being able to cope with, for example, frustration or anger or boredom, or even excitedness and being happy. You know, some children get really excited when you bring them like a science kit where they have to mix things and figure that out. And then they get so excited that you're like, wait, hold on, calm down, relax so that I can give this to you. And then cognitions, of course, most of our learning is focused on cognitive learning and internalization of cognitive aspects and components. And so we define self-regulated learning by the goal, with the knowledge that different types of strategies can shape these different goals. So we can use behavioral or emotional or cognitive strategies that then regulate emotions, for example. And James Gross talks about this a lot, and he talks about the different time sequence of emotions. And so we could think about things differently to regulate emotions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and define that in a minute. And we could also do things and behave in certain ways. So like breathing to relax, that's a physiological type of regulation, but it's focused on emotion regulation. And so these different strategies or different components can be used to regulate whatever the end goal is. And so having this knowledge and understanding about these different components is something that we call meta processes. And we can talk about meta emotion is knowledge and understanding that we have about the way that emotions function and how we can adjust and change our emotions. Meta behavior is related to the behaviors and how the knowledge and know-how that we have on how to shape and change behaviors. And then in cognitions is metacognition. And metacognition is the most highly researched aspect of this. Whereas the self-regulated learning strategy refers to the actual adjustment. So this monitoring and control or change loop of being aware of where I want to get to and whether I'm doing that. And a lot of times for parents, it's really important to maintain, especially young children's learning. And we also don't want to create too big of a gap between the different years. And so that's something that's highly concerning. And in our research, we think about meta processes as shaping these self-regulated learning strategies. So my knowledge and understanding of cognitions would shape my self-regulated learning strategies related to cognition. So if I need to memorize a list of names, or for little kids, if they might need to memorize the letters and the sounds that they make, or for older children, maybe the years of different historical events, going over that and rehearsing is something that might be more related to metacognition. Whether when we're talking about emotional aspects and related here to the medical professions, a lot of times the emotional components take over these other functional capabilities. And so being able to kind of regulate, to understand how to shape these emotions is a meta emotion component. And in our work, we looked at these specific forms of self-regulated learning strategies. So we looked at cognitive self-regulated learning as attention regulation. So we asked them, to rate on a 1 through 5 scale, how much of a hard time they have concentrating on tasks. Reappraisal is a form of emotion regulation. So for example, when I'm faced with a stressful situation, I make myself think about it in a way that helps me keep calm. So being able to think about things differently in order to regulate or to change our emotions. And suppression, I keep my emotions to myself. So not expressing emotions or not allowing oneself to feel these emotions, suppression. Now, in general, we think about reappraisal as a positive form of, or an adaptive form of emotion regulation, because it is associated with higher levels of well-being. And suppression, especially from the clinical perspective, suppression is considered something that is not very adaptive, because if we keep our emotions to ourselves, we're not expressing them, they might come out in different ways and forms. However, within learning context, we found that in adversive situations, so in courses that someone does not like, or maybe even during a war situation, using suppression, so kind of stopping these negative feelings, might actually have some kind of an adaptive output. And then behavior, when we talk about behavior regulation, sample item is a set a plan for how to go about completing my assignments. So being able to plan when I do, what I do, how much I do things. And in terms of behavior regulation, in the current situation with the war, some of the issues might be more of like acting out, or how do we get the children to, an adolescent child to stop crying or yelling or sit, or how do we get younger children to actually not be, running around in the war shelter. And so those are behaviors, things that we can actually see. And so when we're talking about behavior regulation, we're talking about these aspects. Within the learning component, we looked at this as a form of planning. And so what we asked parents to report on their children during lockdown 3. And so in Israel during COVID, we had lockdowns. We had 3 lockdowns, and we had the third lockdown. It was about 6 weeks in December of 2020. And then at the end of the lockdown, kids went back to school. And then 4 months later, we asked, end of the school year, we asked, we had a second data collection. So we had the beginning of lockdown 3 and then to the end of the school year. And then we questioned 140 mothers and fathers. About half of them were mothers, half fathers. And we asked them different types of questions during lockdown 3. And then we also asked the children some things. And the children were in grades 1st through 3rd grade. Okay, so what did we look at more specifically? We had 3 main questions. One question was related to the parents' SRL. So how do parents regulate their own learning and understanding? And so this was highly relevant for COVID with all the guidelines. I'm not sure how it was in Ukraine, but here in Israel, we received an antigen kit with a huge piece of paper that had like 13 or 15 different steps. And I remember when I was looking at it, I was like, wow, I really need to regulate my learning here. And I also got a little bit, kind of anxious about, am I going to do this right or not? And so parents consistently have to learn new things, interpret guidelines, understand situations, be able to read things, and even using a new appliance and being able to read the learning instructions is a form of self-regulated learning, requires self-regulated learning. So we had parents report on their own self-regulated learning. We had them report on their children's self-regulated in-school related aspects. And then we had a form of questions related to parent-child interactions. And then at the end of the school year, we had children report on themselves, how they felt in terms of their language and math success, and then the academic difficulties, which of course we changed and created one scale with 3 items. So when we looked at the study results, what we found is that when parents reported on themselves, the more that they reported on themselves as being planners, so behavioral self-regulated learning, the more that their children reported on themselves as successful. And whereas parents that reported on them suppressing their emotions, that was reported with less school success by their children. And then when the parents reported on their own child, similar findings were behavioral planning that was positively associated with school success. So the more that the parent perceived the child as being a planner, the more the child reported on being able to succeed in school at the end of the year. Whereas in terms of emotional suppression, the more the parent reported on their child as suppressing their emotions, not getting their emotions out, holding them in, the less school success the child reported. And so this is consistent both with the parent and child reports. What was very surprising here is that reappraisal was not related to school success. And in a lot of prior work, reappraisal, so the ability to think about something in a positive light in order to change and adjust our emotions, was positively associated with school success and well-being and all these really good things. And in this case, it wasn't. And so that is something that is different from routine life to a situation that is not very good, you know, being in a lockdown, being in a war, these situations, can we really reappraise it? Not so much. And then parents reported that their children who were cognitively regulated, so they were more attentive, were able to kind of notice when their attention goes into a different place. Their children then at the end of the school year reported higher levels of school success. So this was our first two questions. And then looking at the third question on the parent-child interaction and how the interaction shaped school success, we took an approach of external regulation. So when we think about developmentally how children internalize information regarding a lot of different things, not just school, we talk about external regulation as a process in which a skilled person, a teacher, a parent, it could be an older sibling, guides, supports, directs the learner's self-regulation. Now, we can talk about learning that is academic, like math and literature, but we can also talk about learning that is non-academic, like the guidelines for when I need to go into a shelter, when can I be out of the shelter, what do I need to prepare, when do I need to prepare it? And so these forms of learning are also very relevant. And when we talk about these components, we talk about two different forms of external regulation. We talk about co-regulation and other regulation. So other regulation is explicit explanation, direct guidance, or teaching of the more able individual. So structuring things, positive and negative rewards and reinforcement. So for example, a teacher might say, copy from the board. Whereas co-regulation is more autonomy supportive. It brings about more meta processes, questions, might be rhetorical questions, and also eliciting the strategies from the child. So in this case, it would be, how will you remember what I wrote on the board? And then the child has to think about it. Oh, I'll copy from the board. And then it could also be just like daily life. For us to arrive at time, we need to leave in 5 minutes. That would be other regulation, me telling the child what needs to be done. Whereas in co-regulation, I would be asking them, what do we need to do in order to arrive on time? When do we have to leave? And in the sense of kind of bringing this back to the Ukrainian context right now, it could be in the sense of how do we prepare for, if we have to run to the shelter, what do we need to do? So bringing the child into the process of thinking, what do you need to have with you? Do you need to have a bag with you? What do you need to have in your bag? Oh, your toothbrush, okay, and toothpaste, right? And maybe a towel. So getting the child prepared and having the child think about things rather than doing it for the child would be a way to support co-regulation or these kind of autonomous processes and being active. And so when we ask parents about their interaction with their children during the lockdown, we saw that other regulation was related with less school success when reported by the child at the end of the school year. So the more the parent told the child what to do during the lockdown, the less the child felt that they were successful in school. Whereas with co-regulation, the more the parent elicited from the child on what they should be doing and how they should be doing things and kind of supporting the child's own thinking and regulation, the child then reported on higher school success. And this is an important takeaway because right now, for what's going on in Ukraine, parents are, I'm assuming a lot of the time, also the teachers for their children. And so the more that we can help the parents kind of be able to reframe what they're saying in a way that elicits the solutions from the child, the more we'll be able to form resilience and growth at the end of this situation and when we're on the other side of it. And so, and of course, this takes more patience and more compassion from the parent side. So the main results, parents influence their children's learning processes. We know this, and we know that during times when parents are with their children all the time, that even becomes more pronounced. There's association between parents' self-regulation and their children's success. And also there's associations with the way that parents perceive their child and their child's success. And the parent-child interaction affects their children's success. So the more that parents are able to elicit and get the child to bring about the information, the more the child is then able to really internalize that later. And so what's the impact of this? How can we apply these results, thinking more broadly about what's happening now? So of course, incorporating self-regulatory supports and language into teaching. And when we talk about teaching, it's not just formal teaching, it's also informal teaching. So it could be, like we were saying, kind of these survival or how to plan on how to be able to do this. And when we're talking about the internet or Zoom, remote learning, how to really be able to support our children to think about preparing for whatever's going to be going on online with the class. Also, it's important to reflect on how these non-school related aspects shape learning, and the ramifications of that are great. And to that end, it might be that, like we were saying, that there might be these misdiagnoses, or we might be very focused on a certain outcome. For example, sitting down and learning in the Zoom, whereas the children aren't even available to think about that. And in that sense, we might need to provide supports for learning directly and also indirectly. And what I would like to suggest is that we can think of this kind of self-regulated learning component as something that is also a window for broader regulatory resources to be practiced and then used. And as we build these regulatory components for children and adolescents, as they grow, they're going to be more able adults. A lot of times we don't do that in schools. We don't do it in the learning situation. And so this is an opportunity to think about that. And then recognizing the dynamic between the emergency management and the need for routine is very important as we go into these different situations that are highly devastating, especially during war, when things just feel very, very highly threatening. There needs to be more recognition of that, but at the same time, there is a need for routine. So how can we incorporate routine in order to help children maintain a sense of comfort? At the end of the day, building a community is what is going to kind of provide the safety net and a feeling that we are there for the children. And children need this from their family, from their friends, from the education system. The refugee children, and I'm sure you all have seen this and maybe even know of people that are coping right now with the refugee. But one of the main issues is that the caregivers, the adults themselves, are coping with the situation. And so asking parents to take the lead with their children, it's not necessarily the best solution, but focusing on systemic sustainability through the education system, through the medical system, might be a form of strength for everyone. And also the professionals that take care of these children and families and adults, they also need to be able to somehow, hold on to their own resilience building. They are also people, and they have a hard time recuperating after seeing these devastating things. So, sustainable learning and education is a resiliency building mechanism. And I'd like to invite us to think about what students need to learn to maintain their learning across these different contexts and challenges. Can we maintain learning in refugee camps? And I would like to suggest that we can. The question is how? How can we maintain learning? Refugee camps are not going to have online access, probably, I'm assuming. So a different solution might need to be provided. And of course, education can be an anchor in terms of these aspects. A lot of times in daily life, in normalcy, we lean on our educators to be able to pinpoint when there's certain issues that come up with our children, because they see a lot of children during this time of their life, whether we're talking about kindergarten or early school, primary school, or we're talking about adolescents. The educators know what the norm is for this group, as do the medical providers. You all have a lot of knowledge on what is normative development and what is development that needs more attention. But within these war situations and within this refugee camps and within this, place where there is no routine, that gets lost. And so the question is, what can be done to help children feel normalcy? And part of that is learning. When children and adolescents learn, they expect to be in schools. And so if we're able to create some kind of a framework that enables them to maintain their learning, we're going to be providing them resiliency building skills that they can then use when this horrible situation is over. And so I'm hoping that there is, a little bit of a light of hope, that maybe we can do something to create a more stable environment through learning and through education and by anchoring it in this way. And I wanted to thank you for inviting me. And I wanted to also thank Gili Ashkenazi, Hanovic, and Lihi Sarfati, my PhD students that are helpful with this presentation and all the research that we do. Ministry of Science and Technology in Israel that has funded a lot of this research, as well as the Ministry of Education. And thank you. So I guess I'll stop the share now.
Дякуємо вам, Адар, за цю надзвичайно цікаву лекцію. Попри те, що я не медичний фахівець, мені як мамі ці знання будуть дуже корисні. І я думаю, що те, що ви розповідали про підхід до навчального процесу, дуже на часі сьогодні в Україні. І ми дійсно всі, і медична спільнота, і педагоги маємо докласти дуже багато зусиль, щоб наші діти могли розвиватися, наскільки це можливо тепер. Глядачі, зараз ми переходимо до сесії питань і відповідей. Тож, будь ласка, залишайте ваші запитання в чаті, можна їх писати і в чаті в Zoom, і на YouTube. Я їх зачитаю нашому спікеру, і всі отримають відповідь. Поки що в чаті дуже багато подяк. Всі дякують за лекцію.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here in this forum and, also to be live streamed. And any thoughts or ideas? I don't know that it necessarily has to be a question, but even sharing information that people have on things that have worked for them that might, be a place of stability, ways to let children feel like they're thriving. A lot of times when we're learning things, we feel like we're thriving and we're succeeding. And so I think that if people have ideas to share on how to do that in the shelters, in the ruins, or even for people that are not in the shelters and ruins, but are expecting, the whole Ukraine feels this threat. And so if people have ideas, I think this is a nice platform to kind of share and think through things together. So I hope it's okay to welcome people to comment and not just question.
Так, ми вже маємо одне запитання. Попросили повторити ще раз основні питання для когнітивного, емоційного та поведінкового моніторингу.
Of course. I can also share. So this is kind of methodology question more on how we looked at. Here, let me share with you guys. So, this is very limited in the way that we talked about self-regulated learning strategies. And of course, we can think about these in more broader ways. But for a study, we always have to kind of parse it down. So when we talked about cognitive self-regulated learning, we talked about being able to concentrate and recognizing when we have a hard time concentrating. And so a lot of times, being able to shift. For us, working on the computer, it might be turning off, closing all the tabs. Or if we have our email on and we get the notifications and that takes our attention away. So being able to recognize that and then turning that off. And so for young children and students who are learning online, that might be a strategy that we actually have to talk to them about. When we talked about emotion regulation, the two most highly studied forms of emotion regulation are reappraisal and suppression, where reappraisal is thinking about things in a different way. So a lot of times we can think about, if we think about an exam or a paper that has to be handed in, we might get all stressed about it. And then we can think about, okay, well, maybe I'll have another opportunity, or maybe this is a small part of my grade. And then that kind of decreases the negative feeling involved. And a lot of children I found in the Zoom and the remote learning get really stressed out about exams and you know, and learning and how am I going to do this on my own? I'm at home by myself. And so being able to think about things differently could be helpful, even though our findings with young children of grades 1st through 3rd, for them, reappraisal did not predict their school success. But we will remember that our reports were by the parents because we did not have access to children during lockdown. So that was, you know, what we had to do in order to get at least something of what was going on. And then suppression regulation is stopping the emotional feeling or decreasing what I'm feeling without expressing it. So just kind of, okay, I'm not going to feel anxious. So putting it inside. So from a clinical perspective, suppression tends to be a negative thing, especially psychologically. But when we're talking about learning, that might actually be helpful sometimes. And then behaviorally, we talked about planning. I set a plan for how to go about completing my assignments. So a to-do list. When we study self-regulated learning strategies, not during a confined setting, so just in general, we also have an environmental regulation scale, which is, where do I want to study? Do I change things when I study? How do I shift where I'm studying in order to be most helpful to my studying? During war, there is no such option. You're stuck where you are. And so that wasn't a relevant scale for us. Sometimes for younger children, it might be just changing the light or maybe listening to music and stuff like that. So I hope that answered the question.
Дякую. Наступне запитання про те, як мотивувати дітей навчатися під час військового конфлікту.
Yeah, wow, that's a very hard question. And I think that, you know, that's where the resiliency building comes in. And so I think that part of that, part of the answer is, where are you situated in the military conflict? Are you in a shelter? Are you in a refugee camp? Are you at home? And I ask that because if you are at home, then the child is mainly by themselves. And if you're in a shelter, then there might be a lot of other distractions going on. And in a refugee camp, there's nothing there, right? It's just the kids. And so during war...
Відповідають, що окупована територія вдома людина знаходиться. Людина, яка поставила запитання, відповідає, що вона саме вдома знаходиться на окупованій території.
At home. So at home, you know, they're by themselves, mainly, I'm assuming. And if they're at home, is there internet or is there no internet? Are there friends around? So I'm asking these things because it of course shapes what we can do. Because if a child is at home alone and there's neighbors that they can be with, but they can't go online, then that's a different situation if they can go online. And a lot of times the way that we can motivate our children is through their friends. And so, you know, connecting with parents. So that's why I was saying that the developmentally appropriate ways of interacting sometimes change during crisis. So maybe usually I don't connect with the parent, but now I will, in order to make sure that my child and their child can meet online to study something. Or maybe create a project together, or maybe their friend can come over and they can go over to their friend. And so social interactions is one way to really motivate. lack of motivation might be one of those symptoms that is actually anchored in fear. And so being in a territory that is occupied and there's constant, noise and bombing, or I don't know what's going to happen. Am I safe? Am I not safe? Is there any point in learning? I mean, am I going to be here tomorrow or in a month or when I'm older? So those thoughts are there. And I think that being able to talk about that and say, I know you don't want to learn math, and I don't know the age of this person, the child that is being asked about, but being able to really say, I'm here for you, and I hear you, and I see you, and I know that this is really difficult and it's horrible, but hey, let me tell you that you need to learn because it's going to end. And I know we don't know when it's going to end, but it's going to end. And when it ends, I want you to be on top of your game. I want you to be able to be with the rest of the people in your class. And internationally, we have all these international exams of where children should be at different age levels. And I think that the most important thing to understand is that this is not an elevator that you go and you press the button and now it's going to work forever. No, I mean, this is a conversation that you might have to have twice a day, of, hey, I see you're not reading, or you're not doing your math, or you're not working on the project. What's happening? Are you in your head again? Are you about the thoughts? I'm with you. I'm with you here too. But look, I'm working and I'm doing so let's sit together. And so a lot of times in a crisis situation like this, using the social perspective, what I would not do is sanctions and punishment. Because we're in such a volatile situation, I would take the perspective, or I will invite you guys to take the perspective that children that are not motivated to study, it's not because they're not being good children. It's because they're very concerned with what's happening and they need that hug, whether it's a physical hug or an emotional hug or a verbal hug or a spiritual hug. They need that kind of, you're safe and let's do this. And so let's plan. Let's use this behavioral regulation kind of component and let's plan. And then when we plan, let's not expect the child to actually do everything they plan, right? Because we're in a war. We can't expect things to be by the book. And remember, this is not an elevator. You don't press the button and it works. I might sit with a child and have a whole plan outlined, and then we get to the next day and we have the plan. It's not going as planned. That's okay. If you have 2 or 3 things happening from the plan, that's perfect. So, don't have high expectations, and motivate the child by talking about things together and building it together, and really understanding that this situation is difficult for them, and their lack of motivation is because they're busy with other things. They're feeling the threat to their well-being. They're feeling it, they're seeing it, they're hearing it. And so bringing them back into the perspective through compassion, I would suggest, because when you get into the fighting about things, that's where it ends. And that's where we can use co-regulation and baby steps. If you're able to do something little, good job, mom, good job, dad, you did it. You don't have to do the whole entire schedule. And so, and in that sense, also providing the child agency and autonomy, letting them take charge. And so if they don't want to study a certain aspect, then whatever, think about the 2 or 3 subjects that are most important for you as a parent to have them learn. For some people, it might be math and literature. For other people, it might be science and history. And so focus on 2 or 3 subjects that are the most important for you. And through discussion, bring to the doing. And as I was saying, don't be a perfectionist and don't expect it to just work. Be prepared to have this conversation twice a day, every day until the war is over. So and that's where the caregivers, it's very taxing on the adults, right? So I'm sorry I don't have like a fixed one solution to fix everything, but I think that, the motivation comes from this conversation and seeing the child and really hearing them and giving them the place of, this is difficult for you and it sucks. It's horrible. It's a horrible situation. And we have to continue and push forward. So just like I'm doing my work, you're doing your work, and we are sitting here and doing it together.
Дякую. У наступному запитанні з нами поділилися особистою історією. У доньки 11 років, плач після музичних занять на фортепіано. Складно виконувати усі вказівки вчительки, відповідно, вчителька висловлює незадоволення грою і передбачає низьку оцінку на екзамені. Напруга, негативні емоції до вчительки, рятуємося технікою обійми метелика і обговоренням, що можна робити, щоб покращити гру. Що ще можна робити, щоб допомогти дитині?
So I think that I understood most of the story, but what I'm hearing is that the child is coping with a teacher that they don't like, and that's horrible whether you're in war or not. You know, teachers that we don't like and we don't get along with, that's a difficult situation. I would say, you know, there's always something positive about everyone. And so help the child think of where can you connect with the teacher. So even if the teacher isn't doing the job, you as the parent can ask them, you know, let's think about one positive thing about this teacher or this subject or the way that things are being taught, and connect through this positive thing. It's very difficult to learn a subject or with a person that we don't like. And you know, that's the baseline hypothesis. And so recognizing that. And again, I don't know the subject, but if it's a high priority subject, then, you know, putting in the work with the child, but also with the teacher, picking up the phone and saying, hey, my child is having a really hard time. Can you maybe meet with them one-on-one to discuss what's happening in class? Or can you allow them a little bit more time until they have to hand things in, kind of opening it up and kind of relaxing the situation? If it's a subject that is not that important to you as a parent, you know what, in this situation, you just have to let things go. And we want to anchor the children in the positive things, and we want them to thrive. At the end of the day, having a bad grade in one class is not going to ruin anyone who is 11 years old, and it won't have impact to their career. Now, if this was happening in every single class, then I would be very concerned. And I would seek some medical professional help to think about whether there is a traumatic response going on here that needs to be taken care of now, not after the war as a post-traumatic response, but right now, like what's happening with this child? Is it really specific to this teacher and this subject domain? Can I let it go? Can I help them connect through something that's positive? Or is there something else that's going on and they're letting it out through this dynamic with the teacher?
Дякую. Наступне запитання. Яку роботу провести з педагогами щодо психологічної стійкості дітей у шкільних умовах під час воєнних дій?
So what we've been focusing on, that's a really good question. And what we've been focusing on here is this kind of co-regulation aspect that I spoke about. Let me just quickly find that for you guys here. So when we talk about, how do I, wait, let me just see. I need that here. When we talk about the interaction between caregivers and children or adolescents, we can talk about this different form of external regulation. Now, at the end of the day, people that are able to regulate themselves are people that are able to think about where they want to head and get there and change and adjust. And a person that can adapt themselves and adjust themselves are going to be able to thrive in different situations. And so same with during the war. During the war, we can use these two different forms of regulation. And one thing that's important to know is that this is a messy interaction. We go back and forth from telling children what to do or adolescents and from supporting their autonomy. Now, the co-regulation component, where I support the autonomy of the child, where I ask them questions, where I help them think about the ways that they need to be doing things, that's the place of where we can thrive more, where we can actually try to create this situation into growth. And so it takes more energy, it takes more time, it's something that takes more resources from ourselves. But if we can bring ourselves to the discussion, so for example, with the 11-year-old, saying, hey, let's have a discussion about tomorrow. I didn't like the way that today went. Today was very difficult. You didn't go online to for the course. You weren't motivated. You were unhappy. That made me unhappy. So let's think together. And then we sit down and we think, and it can be like a 5-minute conversation. It doesn't have to be a huge deal. But the idea is to throw the ball back at the children and to let them think, what makes this better? How can I continue working on things? Where can I grow? What is something that's going to help me succeed? And then saying to them, I'm going to try to help you, but this is your responsibility. And then having this back and forth of reminding them, remember we talked about this and we said that you would do A, B, and C. And now I'm asking you, what can you do to make this happen? And so thinking about this from the emotional, behavioral, and cognitive perspective, at the end of the day, trauma is an emotional response. Trauma is something that anchors us down into a negative situation where we feel threat, we feel that we're not going to be able to function, we feel that something bad is going to happen, and it's constant. And then we continue to play this over and over in our head. And that's the post-traumatic response, where this event takes over us. And so if we're able to help children and youth see these different components and take charge of their own regulation, that's where we're going to come out stronger at the end of the day. And when this whole thing is over. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I think that that's one thing that can be really helpful. And then this conversation with compassion, where we're able to see the child and to let them know that, this is a phase that's going to end. It's very easy for us to get used to positive things. Negative things, it's hard for us to get used to them. And when we're living in a war situation, when we're living in an occupied area where we're not feeling safe, that perpetuates, and that becomes part of our being, and that makes it harder for us to be able to thrive. And so the idea is to bring in positive things and to be able to say, okay, what's something that I can do that makes me feel good today? And what's something that I can do that makes me move forward in my way of being? It might be reading something, it might be working on 5 math problems. A lot of times parents think, they have to sit down and do 5 pages of math in order for them to move forward. 5 problems is enough. Every day, 5 problems. So then I'm getting my head working on this type of strategy use. And reading is important too. And so I would say if you need to prioritize the different subject domains, I would say math and reading. Those are the 2 things that are most important, because they're the basic of everything else. And the idea is to not fall behind, so that when we go back into schools, and I'm hoping that it'll be very soon for you guys, that you'll be able to go back into routine, then they have these skills and everything else they can catch up on. And so I think prioritize, and as parents and teachers, think about choose your battles and compassion, and don't be a perfectionist. Don't try to get everything done. Choose a couple of things that are important for you and prioritize them, and everything else, just let it go. Most important is the well-being, is feeling good about ourselves. Because if we don't feel good about ourselves, it doesn't matter what happens around us, we're not going to be happy. And in a situation like the Ukraine right now, it's important to find your strength within, because the outside is chaos. And so if we can help our children and our adolescents kind of find that place of happiness within, it could be something little, I have my favorite ice cream, or wow, you finished the 5 problems in math that I gave you. Those are places where they're going to be able to thrive. And you can have them set their own goals of, if I finish these 5 problems, then I get 2 hours of doing nothing or watching TV or whatever is available in your area for fun. And so bringing that in and being able to monitor where I'm at and how am I going to change where I'm at to feel better. At the end of the day, that is going to be the resiliency building that helps.
Дякую. Наступне запитання про те, чи варто навчати дітей технікам саморегуляції, наприклад, емоційної.
Yes, children should be taught this. Children actually, when they are born, they seek emotion regulation from adults, right? Like, think about it. When a child is uncomfortable, they cry, they want to be held, they want to be hugged, they want to be provided that sense of safety. And what we've been doing with kindergarten teachers and looking at kindergartners and looking at parents, just like we had the first, second, third graders, we're already there thinking about how to bring that into the conversation. And so you bring it into the conversation in an age-appropriate, language. And so with young children, we wouldn't say, let's regulate and monitor and be aware. We would say, how are you feeling? What's going to make you feel better? Let's talk about how to be happy in this horrible situation. Or, say, I know this is a very tough, I know you're scared. It makes sense that you're scared. So giving validation to their feelings and then saying, okay, but let's try to focus on something that is going to make us feel better. And you can use the words regulate and monitor and change and control. You can use these words with the knowledge that they might not really understand them and that I will have to define it to them again and again and again until they're older. But having this conversation and reflecting to them, I see you're feeling unhappy. Can we think about a way to make you a little bit happier in a way that can help you maybe listen to the story that I want to read for you? So we start talking about regulation in a very young age with language that makes sense to the child. The earlier we start this, the more able they will be at a younger age. And so we want to talk about these things at a young age, even with a 2-year-old. 2-year-olds, if any of you have 2-year-olds in a shelter or in this horrible situation, I can only imagine the panic attacks that they get into, and they fall on the floor and I want to eat this, or I want a certain something and I can't give it to you because the stores are closed or it's not available, or we can't go where you want to go, or we're stuck in the house or in the shelter. And then just recognizing, wow, I see you're having a really difficult time. And you will see that reflecting to them, which is the first stage of monitoring, a lot of times catches them off guard because they're at war with you now, right? They're fighting. They want to be able to do what they want to do. And you're like, no, you can't do that. And then just being able to say, hey, I see you. I see that it's really tough. And you'll see a lot of times they stop for a minute and wait, you understand me? You understand what I'm going through? Yes. And that's the monitoring. And we're doing it as adults, we're reflecting to them and letting them know how they're feeling, if that makes sense to them. And then you can say, so let's see how we can make it better. And so definitely age appropriate conversation. With adolescents, you can actually talk about these things more openly, right? And you can make a plan even. You can say, I see you're having a really rough day. It's now afternoon. Let's talk about the evening. Or, I've noticed you've been going to sleep really late. I don't think it's good for you because you can't wake up in the morning and join your friends on Zoom or, or the class or whatever is happening. And so we can talk about these things. And remember that, when you want them to do certain things, that's behaviors, but the emotions might be the strategy to bring to that behavior. Not only the behavior is the strategy to bring to the behavior. Sometimes it's the emotion, especially during these really difficult situations, that is the key to changing a behavior. And so being able to see them and to be compassionate and to really acknowledge where they're at and how difficult it is, that starts a conversation. And I will remind you that with children and adolescents, it's ongoing, it's constant. It's 2-3 times a day, having the same conversation every day until that's been internalized. And so patience, right? Patience is the key word here. And it's very difficult because you guys are all in a difficult situation as well. And so it's a very difficult situation to be in.
Дякую за відповідь. Це було останнє запитання. В нас, на жаль, виходить час, тож мусимо завершувати тренінг. Дякую вам, Адар, ще раз за неймовірну лекцію, за ваш час і досвід. І сподіваюся, в майбутньому ми також будемо співпрацювати, і ви нам багато цікавого розкажете.
Thank you very much for having me, and prayed for you guys, and I hope for good news very soon. And we would love to host you in Israel when this is all over and it's safe for you guys to travel.
Дякую, ви також до нас, сподіваюсь, навідаєтеся вже скоро, коли це все закінчиться. Всім гарного вечора, дякуємо вам, до побачення.